Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the components of the quantitative methodology chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation today, I'd like to give you this information in case you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. And so first, I'll just go over what we will be covering in the presentation today. So this webinar is on the quantitative methodology chapter. So I'll be covering aspects of the quantitative methodology chapter today. I will not be discussing components of qualitative or mixed methods, methodology chapters. If you're interested in those topics, we do have separate webinars for those. At first, I will discuss the purpose of the methodology chapter, and then I'll talk about the different components that are typical to the methodology chapter. So this will include the introduction, research design, the population and sample, information about instrumentation, data collection and analysis procedures, limitations, and ethical considerations. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So we'll have a question session at the end where you can go ahead and type your questions into the questions section. And any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, I will be answering those questions after we've gone through the entire presentation. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter and why it's important to the dissertation. So the purpose of the methodology chapter is to describe how you will be conducting your research. The previous chapters of the dissertation, so namely the introduction and literature review chapters, are aimed at establishing why you need to do your research. After you've finished those chapters, it's time to move on to talking about how you're going to carry out your research. And the important thing to note with the methodology chapter is that the methodology should be detailed enough that your research can be replicated by others. So someone should be able to read your methodology chapter, know exactly how you conducted the research, and be able to carry out the exact same study themselves, having read your chapter. So your chapter should have enough details in it so that someone else could read it and be able to conduct the same exact study that you did. So a lot of people will liken the methodology chapter to an instruction manual where you are providing instructions for how to conduct your study. And others will liken it to a recipe where you might have different components or ingredients such as your participants, the instruments, and the instruments that you're using. And you have to also explain how those ingredients come together in your procedures and so forth. And like a recipe, you would have step-by-step instructions for how to carry that out. And while we will be talking about the components of the methodology chapter that are most common based on our experience with a lot of different schools, you do want to make sure that you check your specific school's guidelines to determine exactly what needs to go in your methodology chapter. So different schools will have different requirements. So some schools may require more sections than what we describe here, or they may require different sections, or they may want it to be organized in a slightly different way. So we'll be covering the most common parts of the methodology, but you do want to defer to the specific guidelines for your school or degree program as you write your chapter. So now let's talk about the different components of the chapter. And like most chapters of the dissertation, you can start with a brief introduction, where you restate the purpose and problem statement, you state your research questions and hypotheses, and you preview the different sections of the chapter. So your restatement of the purpose and problem statements can be a verbatim restatement of how they're presented in earlier chapters, or it can be an abbreviated version of the problem and purpose. However, for your research questions and hypotheses, you want this to state those using the exact same wording every time they appear in your dissertation. So the wording and presentation of your research questions and hypotheses should never change throughout your dissertation. The wording of it should always be exactly the same. And then after you've introduced those pieces of information, you can simply preview what sections will appear in the methodology chapter. And this can be as simple as just listing out the different section headings that will appear in the chapter. Now let's talk about the research design. In the research design section, you want to explain the research design that you've chosen and the rationale for why this research design was the most appropriate for your study. And it's important to note that depending on your school's requirements, you may also be required to talk about the more general research method. So there may be two parts to this, where you first talk about why you chose the general method, which would be quantitative, as opposed to a qualitative or a mixed method. And you then will need to describe the specific research design within quantitative that you've selected. So there, depending on your school's requirements, there could be two parts to this. For the research design, you want to first state the research design you've selected. So within quantitative, this could be correlational design, experimental, quasi-experimental, or causal comparative, or just some examples of some common designs. And you want to state why you selected that design. So this should be related back to your problem, purpose, and research questions. So you should be able to provide rationale for selecting your specific research design and align that with the problem and purpose statements and the research questions that you're trying to answer in your study. For instance, if you picked a correlational design, that may be because your problem and purpose and research questions have to do with determining if there are relationships between variables. So that would be a reason for using a correlational design. And in addition to explaining why the design you picked was most appropriate given the purpose of your study, you may also need to explain why you did not select other types of research designs. So if you picked correlational, then you'll want to talk about why you did not pick experimental or why you did not pick causal comparative. So for instance, if you're doing correlational, maybe it wasn't feasible for you to conduct an experiment because you can't manipulate the variables that you are studying. Or maybe you didn't do causal comparative because your goal is to see if there are relationships between variables and you don't have any groups to compare. So those would be reasons why you wouldn't select those other designs. And just to note, if you do have to discuss the rationale for the general research method, you'll want to follow these same steps when you discuss the research method. So you want to state the research method you selected. In this case, it'd be quantitative. You want to explain why quantitative was the most appropriate method for your study. And you may also need to explain why qualitative or mixed methods were not appropriate for your study. Now we'll get into the population and sample sections. So this is where a lot of students get confused because some students will use the terms population and sample interchangeably, but these are two different concepts. And it's important to understand the difference between the two when you're talking about them in your methodology chapter. So the population is the broad group of individuals or people that your results are intended to generalize to. So for instance, if you're doing a study within education, your population might be teachers, but um, it's likely that your population won't just be, any and all kinds of teachers. It might be, a specific type of teacher. So maybe your population is concerned with high school teachers, or maybe it's elementary school teachers, or university professors, or maybe it's teachers within a specific region. So maybe teachers in the Northeast United States, if there's some kind of a local problem that you're trying to address. So that would be an example of a population. So for instance, like high school teachers in the United States might be your population. And so you want to state that population of interest. And if possible, you want to describe characteristics of the population and provide an estimate of the population size. So if your population was high school teachers in the United States, then you would want to try to estimate, how many high school teachers there are in the United States. You might get this kind of information from some organizations such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or similar organization that keeps track of statistics on these types of things. So you want to do your best to estimate the population size and any characteristics of that population if you can. So now let's talk about the sample. So the sample, as opposed to the population, is just those individuals from the population who will actually participate in your study. So it's the people who are in the population who end up, being invited into your study and accepting the invitation and actually completing your study. That is what your sample is. And so we can kind of explain the difference between the sample and the population in terms of a fishing analogy. So let's say that you plan to go to a lake one day to go fishing. It's unlikely that when you go on that trip to the lake that you're going to catch every single fish in that lake. You'll probably be lucky to catch just a few fish. And so you can think of the population as all of the fish in the lake, and your sample is just the few fish that you managed to catch that day. And so for your sample, you're going to want to describe your sampling strategy or technique. So this may involve something like some form of random sampling, where you randomly select individuals from the population to participate, but it's actually rare to use true random sampling in dissertation level research because it's often not very feasible for you to be able to randomly sample from the entire population. So for instance, if your population, again, was high school teachers in the United States, it's probably not going to be reasonable for you to try to sample from the entire possible pool of every single high school teacher in the United States. It's unlikely that you'd be able to send invitations to all of those individuals. It's more likely that you'd have to use some kind of a non-probability or convenience sample. So you might look at a sample of high school teachers in your specific locale. Or maybe you would look at a sample of high school teachers based on their membership in some kind of National Teachers Association or group that teachers can be a member of, and sample teachers from that group. So that would be an example of a convenience sample where it might not include or may be possible to include um, every single member of the population, but you're getting some kind of a sample based on individuals who are available to you. And so you'll want to describe the technique that you use to sample the individuals from the population, and describe in very great detail how the individuals are going to be selected from the population and recruited into your study. So how exactly are you going to contact these individuals and invite them to participate? Again, if we're using the teacher example, how are you going to identify teachers from the population and contact them? Like I said, are you going to go into local schools and recruit teachers from schools that are local to you? So are you going to go in person and ask them? Are you going to get a list of email addresses from the school principals? Or are you going to use some kind of a teachers association or group where you might be able to get email addresses to contact the teachers? You're going to have some way of contacting them to invite them to participate. And you'll want to provide details on exactly how you're going to do that. And then finally, as part of the sample section, you'll want to calculate and state your target sample size. And for a quantitative study, you would use a power analysis to do this. And I won't go into a lot of detail about power analysis in this presentation, just because we do have other webinars that are specifically dedicated towards discussing power analysis. So if you are interested in more details on that particular topic, I would direct you to those specific webinars. So next we can talk about the instrumentation. So in the instrumentation section, you will want to describe the different data collection instruments that you're going to be using to measure each variable in your study. So by the end of the instrumentation section, you should have described the instrument that you're using to measure all of the variables that are mentioned in your problem purpose statement and research questions and hypotheses. So each of the variables that are identified in those areas should have some kind of instrument or way of measuring those variables. And in the instrumentation section, that is where you describe those instruments. So instrumentation can take on a lot of different forms. So one typical form of instrumentation in dissertation research is a survey instrument. So if you're measuring some kind of construct or concept, like, for instance, self-efficacy or self-esteem, or a psychological construct like anxiety or depression, then you might use some kind of an established survey instrument to measure that concept. However, not all instruments need be survey instruments. So if you're doing something like biomedical research, for instance, and you have physical measurements or variables such as height and weight, you might be using things such as scales, or if you're measuring something like blood pressure, you might have a blood pressure monitor. That would be considered an instrument as well. It's really just anything that you use to measure a certain variable. Regardless of the type of instrumentation that you're using, you'll want to state what the instrument is and how exactly it works. So if you're using a survey instrument, how many items or questions are in the survey instrument? So are you asking items that involve a Likert type response, where people rate statements from strongly agree to strongly disagree, for instance? You'll want to describe exactly how participants are going to be answering the items or the questions. And you'll want to discuss details about the response scale, such as, if it's a Likert scale, and scoring. So are you going to take the responses to the Likert items and average them together or sum them together into a total score? and you'll want to provide evidence for each instrument's validity and reliability. So for survey instruments, validity would typically involve reporting the results of something like a factor analysis. And for reliability, it would be reporting something like Cronbach's alpha or a test-retest correlation, for example. And you can usually find this information in the article that explains the development of the instrument. So the original article where the instrument was first created and described is where you typically find the information for how the validity and reliability was established. And it's also worth noting that oftentimes validity and reliability are treated as separate sections from the instrumentation. So some schools may have a completely separate section dedicated to discussing validity and reliability, or other schools might have you discuss the validity and reliability in the instrumentation section. So after you've discussed your participants and the instruments that you're using, you'll want to talk about your data collection procedures. So how are the participants going to be, how are you going to be administering those instruments to the participants to collect your data? And again, this is one of the most important sections of the methodology chapter because you want to be as detailed as possible and provide step-by-step instructions or a guide for how your data are going to be collected. So it should be, stated very simply in step-by-step fashion, all of the steps that you're going to take to collect the data. So it can start with, as soon as you get institutional review board or IRB approval for your study, what's the first thing you're going to do? How are you going to contact the participants? When are they going to get the survey instrument, or how are they going to get the survey instrument? Are they going to be emailed the survey instrument? Like, is it going to be an online survey where participants are just emailed a link and then they follow the link from their own computers and take the survey online? Or is it going to be done in person? If it's going to be done in person, then where is it going to take place? Are you going to go into the schools and have a time set aside for teachers to come in and take the survey, or how is that going to work? So you want to be very detailed in describing those procedures, how, when, and where participants are going to be completing the instruments that you are going to be administering. You'll also want to talk about informed consent. So how are participants going to provide their consent? So the informed consent process is just where participants get information about the study before you collect any data from them so that they can make an informed decision on whether or not they should participate. And so how are they going to get that consent information, and how are they going to indicate that they consent to participate? And again, when taking into account all of this, you want to make sure that the procedures are detailed enough so that someone else could read your procedures and be able to replicate your study exactly. And one thing that's important to note is up until this point, this discussion has been geared mainly towards primary data collection, where you are actually going to be contacting participants and collecting data from them. But other forms of studies might involve secondary data, where maybe a data set has already been collected and you are just going to use that already existing data set and do some kind of a different analysis on it. So if you're using secondary data, what you describe in the data collection procedures is going to be a little bit different than if you were doing primary data collection. If you're doing secondary data, then you'll mainly want to describe how you are going to get access to that pre-existing data set. So you'll probably um, be getting that data from some kind of an organization, like some organization or data administrator um, keeps the data, and maybe you have to contact them to get permission to use the data and to actually get the data from them, or maybe the data that you're using is from some kind of publicly available source where you just go to a website and follow some steps and download the data from a website. So in your data collection procedures, you just want to detail the steps that you need to take in order to access and obtain that secondary data. So you might have to, describe, the source of the data, where are you going to get the data from? What procedures do you have to follow to get the data? Do you have to get permission? Those types of things. So that will be more of your focus if you are doing a study on secondary data. Then once you talk about how you are collecting the data, you'll also want to talk about how you're going to analyze that data. So as part of your proposal in your methodology chapter, you want to have a very specific plan on how you're going to analyze the data in order to address your research questions and hypotheses. So first, you'll want to describe how the data are going to be compiled or entered into an electronic format. If you're doing an online survey, you could probably already automatically download the data in an electronic format. But if you are doing in-person or paper and pencil data collection, you may have to describe the process for how you're going to enter those responses into an electronic format. You'll want to state the software that you're going to use for the data analysis and data preparation procedures. So for instance, you might use something like SPSS, or we have our own software in Elective Statistics. You'll want to describe how you're going to clean or prepare the data for the analysis. So this can involve a couple of different things. You can check the data for accuracy, especially if you have to manually enter paper and pencil data. You want to make sure that those responses are all entered accurately. You'll want to check the data for missing values and have a plan for how to deal with missing values. So for instance, are you just going to exclude any participants who are missing any data at all? Or are you going to try to include participants who are missing data? And if so, how are you going to deal with the missing values? Are you going to try to replace the missing values or impute them using some kind of an imputation procedure? So you'll want a plan for how you're going to deal with those issues. And you'll also want to talk about any coding or scoring that you need to do on the data in order to calculate the variables that you're going to be using in your analysis. So going back to, if you're using survey instruments, do the surveys require any specific scoring, or is there anything you have to do to calculate the variables based on the participants' responses to the instruments? You'll want to describe those steps in your data analysis plan. In terms of the analyses themselves, you'll want to first state any descriptive statistics you're going to conduct on the variables. So you might want to do descriptives on any demographic information that you collect, as well as on the actual variables from your research questions and hypotheses. And then you're going to want to describe the analysis that you're going to use to answer each research question and hypothesis. So you can organize this just in order of your research questions and hypotheses. So, if you have 3 research questions, for instance, then for each research question, you want to state what analysis you're going to use to answer each one. So you might use something like a t-test or an ANOVA or a regression If so, you want to state for each analysis what your independent and dependent variables are going to be. If you're doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA, or if you're doing a regression, state what your predictors and your criterion variable is going to be. You'll want to state what statistics you're going to be computing. So for a t-test or an ANOVA, you might say you're computing the t or the f statistic and the p-value, as well as maybe the means and the standard deviations for each of the groups you're comparing. Or if you're doing a regression, you may want to state that you're going to report the f-test for the model, the r-squared value, the p-value for the regression, and the results for the individual regression coefficients. And for each analysis, you'll also want to describe the assumptions for the analysis. So pretty much any kind of inferential analysis that you do is going to have a set of assumptions that need to be tested in order to be able to accurately interpret that analysis. So for instance, if you're doing a t-test, you might have to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. So in your data analysis plan, you'll want to list out the assumptions that need to be tested for each analysis and how you're going to test those assumptions. So for normality, are you going to test that using something like a Shapiro-Wilk test, or are you going to test it using histograms or skewness and kurtosis values? So how exactly are you going to test normality? And what are you going to do if the assumption is violated? So if you test normality and you find that the data aren't normally distributed, then what are you going to do about that? So that might involve either transforming the data, removing outliers, or conducting an alternative non-parametric test that doesn't require the assumption of normality. So you'll want to detail each of those things in your data analysis plan. And one of the last sections of the methodology chapter is the limitations. And just note that you might have a limitation section earlier in your dissertation, for instance, in the introduction, but the limitations section in the methodology chapter is going to be specific to the limitations of your research design and your specific study procedures. So these aren't general limitations. These are limitations geared specifically towards the methodology. So there are certain limitations associated with each type of quantitative research design. So for instance, in correlational studies, the main limitation is that you can't determine cause and effect from a correlational study. If you're doing some kind of a survey study, you may have to worry about different types of response bias, such as social desirability bias. So you may need to talk about different types of response bias as a limitation in a survey study. If you're doing some type of longitudinal or repeated measure study, like a pre-test, post-test study, you may need to talk about things like attrition, testing effects, history, or maturation. And then if you're doing some kind of experiment, then you may want to talk about as a limitation external validity. So to what degree can you generalize the results of your experiment to more real world conditions? And so in your limitations section, you'll want to discuss the specific limitations of your design and your data collection procedures, and if possible, talk about how you're going to mitigate those limitations. So for instance, if we're looking at response bias in a survey study, you might mitigate that limitation by stressing that to participants that the survey is optional and that their answers are going to be either anonymous or confidential in order to increase the chances that the participants will provide honest responses. And then one of the last, if not the last section in the methodology chapter usually deals with the ethical considerations or ethical issues. So this is where you talk about the different ethical procedures that need to be followed for your study. And a lot of schools will want you to discuss this in terms of the Belmont Report principles. So the Belmont Report set forth principles that should be followed in order to conduct ethical research involving human participants. And those principles include beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And some schools will want you to state each of those principles and say how you are going to uphold each of those principles in your study. You'll also want to talk about Institutional Review Board or IRB approval in this section. So in virtually any type of research, you'll need approval from an IRB in order to conduct that research. So you'll want to talk about that process. You'll want to, again, talk about informed consent. You may talk about this earlier in your data collection procedures section, but you'll also want to talk about it here because part of the ethical considerations for the study is giving participants informed consent, making sure that they are informed about the study before they participate. And you'll want to talk about the risks involved in the study. And so some students may make the mistake of saying that their study does not involve any risk, but that's not really true because all studies involve some kind of risk. It's just that some studies may have minimal risk. So for instance, if you're just doing an online survey, then that might be a minimal risk study where you wouldn't expect participants to have any greater risk than what they would normally experience in their everyday lives. But other types of studies may have more risk. So if you're doing some kind of biomedical study, for instance, there may be more risk of some type of physical harm, or even if you're doing something like a survey study, but you're doing the survey on a very sensitive topic, or you're doing the study on something like trauma, where people may be asked to recall traumatic experiences, then that can pose some psychological risk. So if your risks are more than minimal, then you'll want to very specifically describe what those risks are and what you're going to be doing to minimize those risks. In any type of study, you'll want to talk about how participants' identities and information are going to be protected. So is the data collection going to be anonymous? So you're not going to collect any personally identifying information, so it won't be possible to identify the participants. If you are going to need to collect personally identifying information, how are you going to protect that information? So how are you going to keep that information secure and confidential? So if you're doing some kind of online survey study, are you going to keep participants' information stored in encrypted cloud storage or on a password protected computer? If you're collecting paper and pencil data, how is that going to be stored and secured? So are you going to be keeping that locked and protected somewhere? And then after the study is over, how are you going to dispose of the data? So schools will usually have requirements for how long you should keep your data before you dispose of it after the study is over. So for instance, they may want you to keep the data for 3 years or 5 years. And then after that time, you should destroy the data. And if so, how is that data going to be destroyed? So you'll want to include those details as well. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation on the different components of the methodology chapter. And again, if you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us to get more information about the types of assistance that we offer. But now I'll go ahead and move on to the question section. So if you do have a question, you can go ahead and enter that into the question section now, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Just looking now, it looks like no one has submitted a question yet, so you can go ahead and anytime you want, you can submit a question and I'll do my best to answer it. So one question is, when looking at the power analysis, if you don't have prior data or conducting a pilot study, would it be acceptable to do a sample size justification? So like I mentioned before, for a quantitative study, the power analysis is the preferred way to do a sample size estimation, but this may be different if you're conducting something like a pilot study, like you mentioned. There are other, there are certain resources that you can look up. There are, academic articles that discuss pilot studies and what an appropriate sample size might be for a pilot study or something like that. But if you don't have, for instance, a prior any prior studies that say what the sample size should be, that's more of a situation where it's important to conduct a power analysis, because the power analysis will be based on the type of statistical analysis that you're doing, not necessarily your topic or your field of study, because the power analysis will be based on just the type of analysis that you're doing and the expected effect size for the effect or relationship that you're looking at. And so that's when you can conduct a power analysis. And like I said, we do have other webinars that talk more specifically about the process for conducting a power analysis. And so if you want more information on that, then you can check out those more specific webinars that are geared towards power analysis. If anybody else has any other questions, feel free to type those into the question section now. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and end our webinar here for today. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar. I hope everyone found it useful. And again, if you're interested in more help, you can use the information you see here to get more one-on-one support. And you're also welcome to check out our webinars on other topics if you're interested in learning about some other topics as well. But again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope you found it useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.